Hi, everyone, and welcome to my very first podcast. My name is Mary Fierce, and I am the OG Woo Woo therapist. That moniker was given to me by a substance abuse client I worked with in 1997. He came back to see me after being clean and sober for a few years and told me he had no idea what kind of woo woo I did on him for him to still be sober, and that I was the OG of woo woo therapy. I kind of like it, and I'm glad that it's stuck. My journey to becoming a therapist was not an easy one, but the journey made me who I am today, and I very much like who I am today. I have endured, survived, and recovered from many of the life issues my clients have endured, and that they have survived, which is what I think makes me capable of meeting my clients where they are in their recovery process when they come into therapy with me. The things I've learned about myself along the way, what the knowledge and skills for managing my life and myself, are what put the woo-woo in what I do. I don't recommend anything to my clients that I have not done or at least tried myself. I believe that spirituality is the secret to healing deeply, and that without some kind of spiritual practices to connect to the energy around us, it can make it more difficult to connect to the energy within us. So many of the things that happen to me, and likewise to my clients, cut us off from the energy of who we really are. I tell all my clients that the goal of therapy is to become the person they were meant to be on the day they were born, before life started going sideways and knocking us off our personal path of truly being who we were meant to be. Albeit, we do become a new, improved version of who we were meant to be when we have recovered from the things we survived. I have been a counselor therapist since 1997. I've worked with all types of folks, including substance-using teens and adults, incarcerated individuals, the homeless, mental health clients, and have been in private practice since 2015, where I specialized in trauma and dissociative disorders. I retired from my private practice on December 2025, and was encouraged by my clients to start a blog or a podcast because they believe I have a lot of information that would help a lot of people in their journey. So since I'm retired now, I think I'll do both. Some of the topics I'm going to talk about are things I learned both as a client in psychotherapy and as a therapist. I was a client in psychotherapy back in the 1980s, a long time before we have a lot of the modern modalities that I use with my clients, like EMDR and things like that. The thing I do want to say is that this is not intended to take the place of counseling or therapy, but to highlight some of the issues that could or need to be addressed with a licensed counselor or therapist. And for some, it will be information to increase understanding of therapeutic issues. None of the information, and please hear me very clearly on this, none of the information that I'm going to talk about should be used to self-diagnose or diagnose anyone else with mental health disorders. Only a licensed practitioner can do that. Trauma, in my experience, is the most misunderstood issue to come up in therapy. It is a term that is thrown around just like narcissist and borderline personality. There are basically two types of trauma. There's big T trauma, where someone is actually in fear for their life, like a car crash, being in combat, a natural disaster, or severe physical abuse. The other is little t trauma, which is the result of emotional, mental, psychological, and spiritual abuse, and the fear there is of being annihilated. In my experience, most mental health issues have a component of little t trauma, at least. There are some exceptions with some mental health disorders where little t or big T trauma are not causative factors, but they are because the brain works differently. These exceptions would be personality disorders and schizophrenia. And that's not to say that they haven't had traumatic experience, but the brains in these folks work very differently. And that is what I'd like to talk a little bit about today. These are not typically my clients that I work with. With the exception of schizophrenia, My clients are basically the people who have suffered trauma at the hands of people with personality disorders. In personality disorders, the primary thing we see in these folks is that they lack conscience and they're incapable of empathy. The other thing we see is that these folks, much of the time, are the bringers of trauma to the people closest to them, who end up being my clients. I'm sure you've heard about the quote-unquote psychopaths that have made it to notoriety, like Ted Bundy, John Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, BTK, and others who have gone on killing sprees. One of the interesting things about these folks, like with Gacy, Dahmer, and BTK, their families had no idea about what they were doing or that they were killers. There is a myriad of docuseries about these folks and their families who were surprised and in disbelief when they found out their loved one was a killer. Then there are those that tortured their families along with their other victims. These folks see nothing wrong with what they're doing to others, which is the lack of conscience, and they have no feelings about the suffering of those related to their victims or their own families, which is the inability to have empathy. Then we have quote-unquote sociopaths, like Dexter, who believed he was driven by the higher good by killing killers. There are also a myriad of shows and docuseries on these folks as well. These folks also lack conscience and are incapable of empathy. Many of the notorious con men and women, along with pimps, crime lords, assassins, human traffickers, gang members, and assorted others, could be diagnosed as sociopathic. Now, this is not to say that all people who engage in these behaviors are sociopathic, but one has to wonder about people when there is a propensity for harming others and not seeming to care about the suffering that it is causing, as long as they are getting what they want out of it. There are some folks that do get trapped into these lifestyles, and they have to do heinous things to not be hurt or killed themselves or to protect their families. They do have a conscience and empathy for those that they cause suffering. That is a difference, and it is a thing that I will talk about in the future. But for the most part, sociopaths talk a good game, but deep down, they just don't care about the feelings of others, like the boss who fires an employee 2 weeks before Christmas and is unconcerned about the pain and suffering of the employee or their family. Then we have the newest pariah on social media, the quote-unquote narcissist. This has become the newest accusation for anyone who may be having a selfish moment or is afraid of some kind of unpleasant consequences by trying to throw the blame for things that they've done off onto other people. Narcissists are also incapable of empathy, but they go one step further and gaslight their victims into believing and feeling responsible for the abuse from the narcissist. Throughout my experience as a therapist, I have worked with many clients who are victims of narcissistic abuse from the people they call mom, dad, grandma, or grandpa. That is not to say that brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, and cousins can't be narcissists, because many times they are. The trauma endured by victims of narcissistic abuse are some of the most difficult folks to help heal because of the deeply held core beliefs they have developed as a result of daily mental, emotional, psychological, and spiritual abuse from a very young age at the hands of someone who is supposed to love and care about them. This will be discussed in greater detail in a future podcast. And just to finish out the brief overview of personality disorders, we have to mention borderline personality disorder, which is another thing that is thrown around on social media just like confetti. The thing about this disorder is that it is believed to have developed as a result of nature and nurture. In infancy, we develop our most significant attachments to our primary caregivers. And when these caregivers are inconsistent with their care and needs meeting, then the infant learns not to trust or bond, which sets their brain development on a trajectory that cannot most times be corrected. These infants develop an extremely anxious way of attaching to other people, always expecting them to disappear and not be there. And then when they grow up, they become individuals who test every relationship they have, whether it's friends, teachers, boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives, or even their own children. They engage in a continual push-pull with relationships to test the consistency of the care and love that they are receiving from someone until they make it impossible for the people who love them and care about them to stay in the relationship with them. This will be discussed further at a future date. The other disorder that falls under the brain not working quote unquote normally is not a personality disorder, but it is a mental health disorder called schizophrenia. This is not a personality disorder. Folks with schizophrenia are capable of very deep emotions and empathy for others, which is a primary difference between schizophrenia and a personality disorder. And another is that the symptoms of schizophrenia can be managed with medication, unlike personality disorders. One of the rules of thumbs that I use to remember the difference when someone is in my client chair is, are the behaviors I'm seeing an indication of who they are or how they are? And with that, I'm going to close for today. I will be discussing some of these topics further and a plethora of other topics in the future. I hope you enjoyed the podcast today. Thank you for listening. And if you like today's topic, give it a like and drop a comment. If there are other topics you would like to know about, drop them in the comments and I will address them to the best of my knowledge. And if I don't know anything about them, I can certainly provide you with a resource, or I can find out to be able to answer the question. Please feel free to follow so that you'll be notified when the next podcast is posted, and I'll be back with you next week.